Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Street Dog Podcast. It's Pronogo and Dynamo. What's up, dude? How you doing?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new podcast.
Yeah, dude.
We're happy to have you here.
It's a pretty epic idea that you and I came up with to just essentially have more podcast content on this channel. Obviously, since Mesk has become inundated recently, he's not really available for podcast recordings, and I feel like there's still some value to be had. And obviously, Dynamo's a man who's actually been on the Big Boys table once or twice to talk about some things, and obviously been on the channel as a guest caster, a guest commentator for some of the LPs that I've done in the past, like the Red Alert series or the early Warcraft games, and even some Warcraft 3 custom content, if you can call Legends of Arcane content. So he's a natural fit to come on, and we're just going to talk shop about some stuff we've been playing lately and some things that we've heard about custom content, and as well as like smaller scale indie projects. Like the reason why I was thinking we could also pivot towards indie games as well is because sometimes custom content does sort of transcend custom content, like the idea of a mod or a campaign mission or something like that, and it becomes its own title, which is what this Ion Maiden game, which turned into Ion Fury or something after they were threatened with legal action. Like that's an example of a game that has a lot of roots in just being a mod or being a rebuild of another title, and obviously has essentially become its own game now. So that's like an example where obviously we could sort of pivot to what would be considered by most an indie title, even though it has a lot of roots in the modding scene or the custom content scene. So that's essentially
Right.
what this podcast is all going to be about. Is just what we've been experiencing in the gaming world, but with a particular deference to custom content. So
Yeah, exactly. And regarding mostly the FPS and RTS genres, as those are the ones we are most familiar with, and I think a perfect example is actually Priority Survive of all things. I recently rewatched the playthrough of that insane game, and at several points you mentioned how it really feels like a bad StarCraft custom campaign. And I
yeah,
think that really basically sums it up. Obviously, the people who made that game, obviously they were low on budget, low on time, or whatever. But they were trying to make an experience that felt like it would be a StarCraft custom campaign. Essentially, the units were modeled after the StarCraft units. I guess you could compare it to, I don't know, Insurrection maybe, with all the pre-placed junk. And I think it's definitely an example of the same idea that people have for custom campaigns instead of being applied to a brand new game. Whether it was successful or not is a completely different story, but I think it's definitely that's where comes from. Basically, that's the origin of it.
Priority
Just like
Survive is a really weird example. I feel like they really tried to combine a bunch of different titles, from what I can tell. And I only really played the Command and Conquer series well after I played Priority Survive. But people in the comment section were saying, "Oh, there's some similarities to Command and Conquer here." I guess, I'm not sure if this is in any of the Command and Conquer games, but there are other RTS games that have a spin key, which is obviously like an insane thing to me. Like the idea that you just have a key that makes units move around in a seemingly random pattern. I suppose it's actually supposed to help the units deal with AoE, and that might have actually been a real use for that key. And for all I know, maybe Dark Colony even had this key. I vaguely recall something like that too, but I don't fully remember, because it's hard to remember if it just had the Salway monkey noise or if like what a psychotic
that
thing.
one it did have.
Yeah, I know it had that, but I'm not sure if it also had a spin key back in that game too. So like, there's a lot of things taken, be it sounds or mechanics or whatever, from other RTS games, and I think maybe Total Annihilation was probably an RTS that had a spin key. If I had to guess, like where that might have originated from, because obviously that's a game that prioritized scale over like. I'm not really 100% sure what you would call it, but basically they have a lot of units that are very similar to each other. I guess the Age of Empires series is kind of like this, where there's not really there's a lot of role overlap for units, and they sort of differentiate between the units based on like tiers, or maybe like one unit hard counters a different unit, or one unit has some special interaction here or some sort of improved context there. Priority Survive was much simpler than that. It really didn't have that many units. I think it had Command and Conquer style base building, from what I remember. Like, I don't remember actually
Sort of, yeah.
ordering my workers to build anything. But at the same time, it didn't even seem to have functioning AI. Like, the AI didn't actually build anything. I don't even know if it was possible for the AI to build new structures. I don't think I ever saw that in the playthrough. So there's that. There's obviously, I think your allied pirate AI that randomly shows up in the middle of the, I think, third or fourth map. They were building some stuff, I think, but It was definitely a wild ride, man. And then, of course, they have Mitt Romney's portrait, and yeah. So like, I really don't know what the fuck was going on with that project. What a strange game. That honestly, that's like somebody actually did try to do what iQuare has suggested a few times for map crap, where they have RTS crap, where they just see if they can make an entire new RTS game in 4 hours or something. Like I could believe that was the inspiration for that game, but as you say, it's a game where it was clearly meant to be. It was just a small team of I think 3 people who worked on it, and then obviously they had some voice actors and maybe some external like outsourced art or something like that. But for the most part, like it seemed like it was just a team of 3 people. Obviously, famously, artist Yosef, motherfucker, with his head in the game files. That was also insane. So it really does like play out like a series of inside jokes that you have no context for and probably never will have context for. And it was released for free. Like, credit to them. They didn't try to sell this game. So it was very clearly understood that it was not the caliber necessary to fetch a price tag. But still a wild ride of a game. And if you haven't seen the playthrough, I don't necessarily recommend playing it yourself because some of the stuff is, as Dynamo points out, like similar to Insurrection and probably even like a level above in terms of the pre-placed junk. But also, since it's a new game, it's not like playing StarCraft in the same way. You've got to learn some new mechanics. There's veterancy, and the degree to which it actually improves your units seems rather confusing. There was that famous part of, I think, the second video in the playthrough where I just had all of my infantry shooting a 5,000 HP structure, and I got up and went to use the bathroom because, like, by shooting, they actually get veterancy points. And it took them 8 years to actually kill that structure. So that was, like, an example of where, like, I'm not even really sure if this is going to help me, but it might. And I have to use the bathroom anyway, so might as well, that's like leaving an auto clicker on into your mobile game while you use the bathroom or something. That's a next level strat and a real pioneering mechanic for those future games that if you can even call those games on the phones. So yeah, I'm not really sure what you think about Priority Survive nowadays. It's especially since you rewatched it. I think I did actually go back and listen to a few things because you had sent me the clip of when we first saw the Mitt Romney portrait or something, or no, it was some unit response that one of those
I'll
guys
send you
said.
downstairs.
Oh yeah,
There's
was it the shark?
Flying unit that says that. Yeah, exactly.
I'll send you downstairs. I can only imagine that's some like really poor Google Translate version of "I'll send you to hell" or something. That's the only
it's
thing.
Probably like since it says that when it targets air units, that's probably just saying that as a way of saying I'll bring you down or whatever, I'll shoot you down. And they just say I'll send you downstairs.
Smell
Which
my
sounds like, I don't
socks,
know, some sort of punishment. Like you've misbehaved, so you're gonna go to the fucking cellar or whatever.
Yeah, you're gonna be Harry Potter or something, just living under the staircase. That's some next level shit, man. I don't know what happened there. I actually wish there were more games like Priority Survive. In fact, if there are more games like Priority Survive and anybody is aware of any of them, please comment them below because like those kinds of experiences you only get once or twice in this life. I feel like you just don't have the same degree. Like the Dark Colony seems like it was actually like it was a little bit more. It was not as bad as Priority Survive in terms of like intentional or not like. It's like the quality of the movie The Room, which is famous for having like all of the makings of somebody who thinks they're making an epic movie, but it's actually horrible. And so it's unintentional comedy. Whereas like Dark Colony kind of took the piss a little bit out of its own, like, its cutscenes were really goofy. It was a worse gameplay experience than Priority Survive, I would say. But in terms of like whether or not it knew it was bad, I feel like it did know, or like it knew it wasn't taking itself seriously. Whereas I don't think that Priority Survive was taking itself seriously, but I think it was not fully aware of how ridiculous and absurd it actually was, which is what led a little bit more to the absurdity factor in the first place. The fact that it was so absurd without really feeling like the developers knew how absurd this game actually was. That's really what added a level of charm that you don't normally get out of those games. So yeah, looking for more of those.
Yeah, absolutely. There's regarding like the base building and stuff. It was similar to Command and Conquer in the sense that it did not employ workers, but it did not have like the same system otherwise. For example, you can build MCV equivalent, which is not even a moving vehicle. It's just like a regular structure, like a command center, basically. You can just place it anywhere on the map, and it just takes 5 years to build for whatever reason. And besides that, I think it's just similar to some other games. Like there's many games that employed like a combination of the StarCraft and Command and Conquer systems. For example, like as everyone knows, in StarCraft you have workers that you use both to build and to collect resources. But many games employ a system where the two are actually separate. Command and Conquer is one such case, but you can also have games like Dark Reign, for example, which is a pretty early RTS. I think it's from '97. And it has basically the worker system from StarCraft or Warcraft, but it has the harvester system from Command and Conquer. So it basically has a combination of the two. Then you have another game like Crash, Kill, and Destroy, for example, which is another early title, again from '97, I believe, or maybe even '96. And that one also has no workers, like Priority Survive, and you can also build many buildings at the same time. But otherwise, it has... it actually requires you to build a structure like a refinery for the Vespin gas, except it's for oil. So it basically still has that element that, even though it was released before StarCraft, I guess it was inspired by Warcraft 2 or whatever. Because Warcraft 2 also had all platforms that you would use at sea.
Right.
And basically, you all see these games employing different elements from all of them. I think mostly because they were just trying to be a little bit different in order to avoid being called a blatant copy of another game, in this case, Command & Conquer. So they tried to mix it up a little bit. But yeah, I mean, in the end, it doesn't really make a massive difference. Like, let's just say Priority Survive employed smaller workers to collect resources instead of those big, bulky harvesters. I don't think it would have made the game any better. I mean, ultimately, the issues were rather deeply rooted into the game's core.
Yeah.
Shall we say.
Well, not only that, but you also have to take into account the fact that those harvesters that you're talking about, like their AI by themselves, they would actually just start kissing each other instead of like they would bump into each other nose first over the last Nazar field. Why is it Nazar, by the way? Could you? That was another like sort of side tangent, but at some point you saw that there was a Nazar amulet and that it wasn't a custom Discord emote. It was like actually just a regular one. Yeah, because like Nazar is like some crystal in Jerusalem or something. Let me look that up. Actually, I was really shocked when it's an eye-shaped amulet believed to protect against the evil eye. Oh, okay, maybe it's not even Jewish. Hold on. Looks like it's Arabic. So yeah, it's actually a real thing, but they just named it after this amulet, which is made out of handmade glass. So that's pretty cool. I don't know how it's supposed to protect you against the evil eye or whatever, but yeah. So that's
maybe
psychotic.
it detects those hidden zerglings, because that game had fucking stealth zerglings.
It did have stealth zerglings, and Marines were detectors or whatever they regulators or something. I forget what they were.
Yeah. Regulators.
Direction
orienters. Can you imagine that in StarCraft, like that being the game plan, like the game state, where you need a Marine to detect Zerglings? I mean, that would just be insane. And yet they fucking did it.
I know. I don't know if there was only one other detection unit for that race too, and I think it was I don't know what, I think it might have actually just been called Detector, which is
exactly.
So dumb. Why are they always stupid names too? And they're all action verb stuff. Like Liberator was Romney.
And then you have Alien Cannon, which is not even an alien cannon.
Yeah, it's just helmed by some guy who looks kind of like Arnold Schwarzenegger's brother or something. Dude, why was there Arnold in that game? Do you know?
I mean, I guess they thought they were being funny. Again, like you said, they were just trying to, like laugh about it. Like, I bet in their development studio or garage or whatever the fuck they made the game in, they were like, oh, look, I added Arnold to the game, haha. But my favorite part is that this company was actually hired by Bethesda to work on whatever project. Like, they actually, became a company involved in the commercial games world. And in their portfolio, look at what they have.
Oh shit!
They show the man himself. They show Mitt Romney. That's literally like.
Oh yeah, it's just like part of it. Yeah, that's amazing. I'll have to put that in the description. So that's pretty epic. I like how he's not even like in full focus either. He's like, why would you put that portrait?
Yeah,
there's some reasonable portraits in that game, but that one is not one of them. His hat is like photoshopped on. His face is too small. Amazing.
Absolutely.
They
I
also have
mean,
a screenshot of him, the ice tile set that's not even in the game. That's pretty cool too.
Yeah. Maybe that's the one that convinced Bethesda to hire them.
Yeah, they were like, holy shit, dude, these guys made Romney before he was even a politician.
Oh my god. Well, aside from Priority Survive and Dark Colony, which is a game I would rather forget ever existed. I mean, I tried to play it and I couldn't get past 2 levels. It was just that insufferable. I think the playthrough went unfinished in the end. I mean,
I think I
there's a good
started
reason
on the
why.
expansion. Yeah, there was. I think I didn't get too far into that. I'm pretty sure I completed the main story, which was definitely a shit show. But the expansion, basically, it forced you to actually try to. It's one of the rare RTS games that actually does make you play well at the game. But playing well at that game is horrible. Like, it's a terrible experience because you're very limited by the user interface. So you're also like their idea of expanding in that game is just moving a unit over a energy field or whatever and then deploying it. And like, that's not particularly compelling. And I guess you could like static defense with units that you could also deploy in a similar fashion.
Yeah,
but
you cannot build another town center.
You're right.
Or whatever.
Yeah. So I don't personally find it particularly compelling. And I also don't really appreciate getting shat on by Tony, who just like rockets poop balls at you for some reason. Like, that's a real.
Well, a key issue with that game is that unit movement in general felt completely horrible. Like, the units would just they were very slow, all of them, very sluggish to actually control.
Yeah.
They had all these animations. I guess they're cute, but you can make them in a way that doesn't impact the gameplay itself. But more than anything, it just made combat a chore every which way. Especially when you get situations where you have like those giant mechs that are actually melee units for whatever reason. Like,
Right.
they have like a range of 1. And then you get situations like the micro missions set inside the fortress or whatever, like those gray corridors maps that were later in the campaign. And considering how horrible the combat is, the fact that you have to do it in enclosed space is even worse. So it's just an experience I would not recommend to anyone.
Yeah.
And I don't think
it's
it
crazy.
really, like, it was an early game. I think it was 97 again. Let me actually look it up. That Colony was from September 97, yeah. But I mean, I don't think it was really innovative or compelling compared to other games at the time. Again, Dark Reign came out at about the same time, and it was a much better game in every which way. Like, you could actually expand, you could actually do anything. So, yeah.
I'm just impressed that they managed to make a game and have the monkey sound and you know, it's just the fact that we have 2 RTS games, if you can call either one of those games RTS games. It's the fact that we've got 2 of them with that monkey sound. Just impressive.
Yeah.
Also, I really want to point out that like Priority Survive has that monkey sound play like every fucking 0.5 seconds or something. It's like really, really common in that game. Whereas it was it was really psychotic in Dark Colony to go from having it be all the time to in Priority Survive to in Dark Colony you have it play once every like 30 seconds or a minute. And the idea, like when I first heard it, I was like, "What? Am I going crazy?" And it took me a while to hear it again because of the the longer delay or whatever. So
yeah,
I was fucking,
and it only shows up on some maps, whereas in Priority Survive, it's all of them.
Yeah, it's everywhere. So can't believe it. Fucking
Salwe.
alien apes.
The fucking file name is Salwe or whatever.
Yeah, and that is really insane. I don't know what's going on there. So anyway, that's our takes on those games. Neither of them are particularly worth your time, but you might appreciate the playthrough of at least the early segment or like maybe the first video for Dark Colony. It's not really worth a watch either because it's just that bad. But Priority Survive, I would say watch the whole fucking thing. It's pretty funny. So it's just me losing my mind over time.
And the 2 games are separated by like 10 years.
Right, yeah. It was 2008,
They do
I think,
have some elements in common.
Yeah.
Like the monkey sound. So, yeah. Who knew that links could be achieved even through fucking monkeys?
Yeah, I'm amazed as usual. But so I was curious as to what you've been doing on the FPS side of things. You know, if there's been lately.
Yeah, well, this past few months I've had a little bit more time to play some stuff. I've been live streaming some of it on Discord. I probably should just set up Twitch or whatever to a few friends of mine who sometimes just like watching me play some stuff. And I've played. Well, I guess one I can talk about is called Doom: The Golden Souls. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It sort of made the rounds even on social media a while ago. But
I have not heard of it personally.
basically, the idea is, I don't know if you've ever played the Mario games. Have you ever played like Mario 64, Mario World, Mario Land, or whatever?
I think I played one of the more recent ones, and before that, I played a couple of like some of the really old ones, like Super Mario Brothers 1 and 2, I think. So that's pretty much the extent of my history with it.
Yeah, so you probably played them a long time ago. But yeah, so the idea behind this mod is that it tries to combine the elements of Doom with those of Super Mario. So you have like the basic Doom gameplay, like you have the pistol, the super shotgun, the enemies are mostly Doom ones as well. But then you have elements from the Super Mario games, such as you have to collect coins, the environments are pretty close to what the Mario games have. I'll just post a screenshot so you can basically get an idea, and then I'll post a link in the description so that people can actually see what the mod is like. But basically, the idea is that it tries to mix an FPS with a platformer with platformer elements, but having FPS still be the main focus. So there are actually 3 chapters to this mod. Like there's Golden Souls 1, 2, and 3. I've only played and completed the first one, and I actually started playing the second one 2 days ago. And I mostly wanted to play the second one as that's the one I heard the most about. The first one is pretty old at this point. It was made in 2012, I think. And I imagine it was going to be a little bit less polished, as it was one of the author's first works. And indeed, having played it, there were some problems with it that I was hoping would be solved in the sequel. So basically, being an early mode, there are some levels that are pretty good. There are some elements that are pretty good, but some of the levels are pretty grindy and not very fun to play, and some of them lack focus. So basically, what I was hoping for was that the sequel will solve this and improve the scale or whatever. Instead, I got something that's quite different. And what's interesting is that the author himself talked about this. So I'm just gonna quote what he says, and then I'm just gonna give my own thoughts of it. So let me just pick it up. Okay. So this is from the author himself. When I started working on Golden Souls 1, the idea was to bring the gameplay of collectathon games such as Mario 64 and Banjo-Kazooie into Doom, but after the release, I felt like I didn't really achieve what I was going for. The mod was fun, sure, but it lacked the entire sandbox aspect of those games, aside from the red coin challenges. And that's actually true, because like the mod has like the aesthetic, etc., but the levels are otherwise linear. Like there is a hub where you can choose which level to play in which order, but you don't really have to collect stuff. You just have to get to the exit. And so it felt more well. I don't want to say railroaded. It just didn't have the same open world aspect that games like Banjo-Kazooie on the Nintendo 64 days had. So the author continues. With Golden Souls 2, I wanted to embrace the linearity of the first game by focusing on less open but still fun to explore levels, platformer style. Yet, after I completed the second game as well, I felt like something was missing. In the next few months, ideas on how to create a chapter system came to mind, along with the help and advice of fellow Doom modders. I've decided to low-key work on this one to scratch that itch. So here we go again, back to the roots of this saga, with the original idea fully realized. This is what he wrote for the third chapter, which is still in development, but there's a demo version of the mod that's out and available to play. So basically, he wanted to create the collectathon aspect, but the original mod was relatively limited in scope regarding what it did. So he felt like he didn't accomplish what he set out to do. But when he made the sequel, he actually basically dialed down on the quote-unquote linearity. So the levels that I played so far of the sequel, I've only played like 6 levels or so. I was thinking they would be more open and more ambitious in scope than the previous one, and instead what I got was a mod where they're more polished. They're definitely more fun to play. Like they feel like levels that have more thought put into them than the sometimes random levels from the first one. Like some of them were good, but some of them felt like they were solely there just so that the author could say, "Oh, look, I made a level based off Donkey Kong Country," for example, whereas the level itself was nothing special at all. But the levels are actually somewhat simpler in terms of the layout, like in terms of I want to say they're just less ambitious in what they're trying to achieve, and that came out as a surprise to me. But at the same time, I'm glad that the author himself recognizes this and is actually, trying to experiment with different styles. So what I was thinking was going to be the massive open world style is actually in the third mode and not the second one, which is what I'm playing right now. And I think it's just a pretty interesting look of it. Basically, it's a pretty it's a series that's not just the same shit. Basically, for like, I don't know, Retribution, for example, you play 3 campaigns. They're pretty much mostly the same stuff, made by the same guys. They don't really offer much in terms of varied gameplay from one campaign to the next. I mean, you've played that, so you probably remember.
Right.
But in this case, I would say the author is trying to do something radically different for each one. And even though I was hoping for the like open world style levels, I'm pretty happy with the linear ones as well. I mean, I don't really mind. So I'm just going through that for now, and I think it's a pretty successful attempt. I mean, obviously, when you are like, there's always the saying, right? Nobody wants to do platforming in an FPS game, and I think that's true. But when you're making a project that actively tries to be like somewhat in the middle, like it's not just an FPS game where you have all the mechanics, like Half-Life, for example, you have the mechanics of shooting, etc., and then you have to stop to do a quick time event puzzle, or you have to stop to do a jumping puzzle with mechanics that were clearly not intended to be used for that, because the physics are just not suited for it. Whereas in this project, since the physics are actually pretty well done, like you can jump very high up, just like in a Mario game. Like you have a lot of air control, so you can move while you're in the air pretty efficiently. So doing the platforming, even though it's much more limited in scope compared to what you would get in a regular Mario game, I think it's pretty. It works. I mean, it definitely works. It's an example of something that I was skeptical about, but upon playing it, I would say overall it's a pretty nice attempt. So all those games that did platforming before, like in the FPS genre, I can think of a few. Again, Half-Life is an example, but another example is the console version of Power Slave, which in the later levels consists of jumping over instant death lava pits, which is as fun as it sounds.
Sounds like some of the Doom expansion levels to me.
Yeah, like those are definitely poor examples on how to do this concept, whereas this mod did a much better job of it, I would say. It's a pretty successful experiment so far, even though it has its limits and its flaws as everything else. I'll just post the links in the chat so they can be posted in the description later, before I forget. And
one of the things it sounds like to me is it's almost like you're taking this mechanic that is normally just a component rather than the focus of a full like FPS level, and they're actually sort of leaning into it more than would it normally be like the consensus intelligent thing to do. But what was successful about this in a way that like you wouldn't expect. So I'm trying to like drag it back to an RTS perspective just for a second so that I can see if this analogy makes sense to you. But it would be like if somebody was making a mission where there was smaller scale and more about micro, and they were actually successful with leaning more towards a micro mission, despite the fact that normally it's not, like it's an ill-advised thing. Like normally it does not work out. Normally it's very radical in terms of a change and all that stuff. But because of the way that this was handled in a different fashion, you have a situation where now it's actually working out in a way that you wouldn't normally expect. Like what do you make of that? Like, are there similarities to that sort of concept where, like, obviously platforming is not really meant to be the focus of an FPS normally, but if you're going to work it in more heavily, then the onus is on you to actually generate systems where that is something that you can reward the player for doing well at. And normally you don't have that opportunity in micromaps. Normally there's not a complete game state for you to even look at in a micro mission, right? Which is, I imagine, what the main problem would be in most cases that have tried to do something different with the like with the platforming in an FPS game. I imagine most of the criticism for that would be something like, hey, you don't have a complete like game here. We're not even really like fully playing a game because you focus so heavily on this, but you removed so much so that you could focus on the platforming, but you didn't provide enough as a replacement. That's usually the criticism that rings true for micro missions in an RTS context. So I'm curious as to whether or not there's a parallel when you compare that to the FPS context here.
Well, I think if we again take Half-Life as well as StarCraft, the original StarCraft, for example, as games we can look at for this, I think the similarity is that the jumping puzzle and the micro mission are essentially roadblocks. They're just roadblocks that the game arbitrarily erects, in that you were just trying to experiment with the game's mechanics, you were trying to interact with the game, and suddenly you have to stop doing that. You have to stop and you have to slow down, and you have to try to engage with something you can't really fully engage with because it's not fully fleshed out in a way that allows you to engage with it in the first place. And I think that's true both for the Half-Life jumping puzzles or other cases. I don't know, like you've played some more recent FPS games. I don't know if maybe they have like the Metro games. They had some psychotic tunnels. I don't know if those maybe also if those can also be counted as roadblocks.
Yeah, it's like essentially changing the pace for no reason other than to change. It's change for change's sake, rather than because you think this actually adds something to the overall gameplay loop. Like
Right.
what they're doing is they're changing it because they're insecure about how their core gameplay loop actually is, or because they just believe that like I would imagine like that's like the subconscious reason, and then what they'll say to justify it is, well, every game needs to have a change of pace sometimes. Like they've bought into some basically a false premise where you actually have to change the pace in order to be compelling, when in reality the most consistent games are usually the best ones. If we think to StarCraft's multiplayer, if we think to some of those other titles that have just had that longevity, that have essentially been proven out just by virtue of how long they've survived. Like even, in terms of Counter-Strike's multiplayer, that's a game where it has changed very little ultimately. And it's not like there's a radical difference between, each individual map you play or whatever. Even the game modes are relatively similar as well, if they're meant to be competitive. So that's a situation as well where it's sort of like in StarCraft, in the same sort of way. So yeah, I can say that pretty much any game that I've played in the last couple years that has been classed as a shooter, like the Metro games, they've always had something that has just decided to completely interrupt the overall idea of whatever the gameplay loop was, and give you a completely new thing that changes everything. And sometimes they justify it or try to justify it with story. Other times they say it's a change of pace. In no case is it actually beneficial to the game state, though.
Right, yeah. The key difference with Golden Souls is that the jumping systems are actually fully implemented into the game set itself. So you may just be jumping and shooting at the same time. It's not something that's just an afterthought, like something you have to do in order to continue playing what you were playing previously. And I think that's generally the best way to approach this. Like if you want to make a micro game, like a game that focuses on micro maps, just make I think they're called real-time tactics games. That's the genre name. There's a bunch of them.
Yeah, where
I
it's
haven't
more
really
about
played
like,
any, but
yeah, certainly smaller scale. There is no base management to the same degree. In some cases, you'll still be training units, but it's almost like it's almost like a MOBA, except instead of controlling heroes, you're training the minions that are spawning and running down the waves or something. You know what I mean? So like that would be what my description of real time tactics usually are, like company heroes and stuff. But yeah, I mean, like what it comes down to is it sounds like they actually incorporated, the developers of Golden Source actually incorporated the platforming and the mechanics that you're using as something that you need to be mindful of and eventually master over time throughout the entire production. So it's like another key component to when a product is essentially incomplete in what it provides you, is when you're learning a certain mechanic that just is not even worth even remembering in the next mission. Like mission 1, you learn this mechanic. Mission 2 and beyond, you never use it again. Like that's a situation where there is no mastery. There is no opportunity for any of that, right? So like that's a situation where you have to be you almost have to hope that the developer realizes halfway through this that they should actually have some sort of consistent skill expression be a part of the production. So like that just never happens if you're constantly changing the mechanics that are at play. Whereas if you actually have a series of consistent events or consistent mechanics, that's an opportunity for players to express how good they are able to get at your game, which is another angle for why you should be doing things consistently as opposed to just changing shit for the sake of changing shit. So Yeah, it sounds like something that's worth checking out. I guess especially if you are actually in the mood for something that is a change of pace, but not something that's just going to,
Yeah,
change it every single mission or whatever. So that's an interesting thing
yeah,
because I feel like there is value in offering a different experience, but you have to offer whatever your different experience is consistently, not just have it be like, oh yeah, we're gonna change it up all the time. I don't know what you think about that or how that has been used in the past or whatever, but it's just interesting to me that there's like
yeah.
so much
Like
of that.
again, that's what the fallacy is about, right? The change of pace in itself is good, and that's what they talk about. Like they talk about change of pace being necessary, and sometimes it is. In that the game might just get monotonous if you're just doing the same thing over and over. If you're just going through the motions, but if what you're actually switching the game towards is not as good as what you were doing before, then that's what the problem begins. And I think that's what they conveniently forget to mention every time. I mean, sure, they're changing the pace, but they're not doing it in a way that actually improves the game. Whereas if we're doing it in a way that improved what you were playing, I would have no issues with it, as long as, again, it's consistent, it's fair, it's not just something that you can do absolutely nothing about. I mean, there's many, many examples. Throughout the gaming world. I mean, I don't know if you ever played the Ratchet and Clank games. Like there are like platform shooters from the PlayStation 2 era.
Yeah,
I remember in the
I've only
second
seen like
game.
the box art. I've never actually seen the games, but I know they're a 3D platformer, correct? Like that's
Yeah,
a yeah.
yeah. I remember playing them a long time ago, back in the PlayStation 2 days. And one of them, I believe it was the second one. Like most of the time, you're on foot shooting weapons and jumping on stuff. But then there's abruptly a mission that involves a spaceship. So you have to use the spaceship to destroy a series of targets within a time limit. And I remember it took me like 1 hour to get through this mission, whereas the mission from before it took me about 10 minutes because I was completely unprepared for. The spaceship controls and the actual mission objectives. There were obviously like time limits in general bullshit, but the main issue is that what was thrown my way was simply so completely removed from the previous experience that there was no way I was gonna be able to do any good at that mission without previous experience again. So the game just throws this mission at you, it changes the pace, that's fine, but it doesn't change it in a way that results in a fun experience. It just frustrates you. And I remember thinking at the time, I still remember this, why can't I just skip this? Like, why can't I do
Yeah.
this later as a bonus mission or whatever? Why do I have to have this roadblock forced upon me to prevent me from playing the rest of the game? I think that's really the key issue with all these games. Again, Half-Life with the jumping puzzles, or again, like the micro missions in games like StarCraft or whatever. Like, StarCraft isn't even the worst example of it because at least there's not that many micro missions. I think Brood War are some more than the original, but again, you have a game like Warcraft 3 where like half the fucking missions are micro. So uh,
Yeah.
it
Warcraft 3 is
really
an
can
excellent
be.
example of the same thing because I don't even think it was them changing the pace from the perspective of like if I'm trying to steel man the argument that the Warcraft 3 devs must have had, essentially the justification for whatever decisions they made or didn't make, I imagine it must have been something to the effect of like, take a look at this game. Here's our story. Our story is the most important thing, and we need to make some decisions based on our story. I don't think that they actually were even in the headspace where they could think about like things to change the pace up. I mean, maybe that was the case. Like maybe they were just full carnival riding it and just saying like, yeah, we need a bonus mission for like a tower defense map. We need a bunch of micro stuff. We need a tug of war map in the middle of the campaign. Like I don't know if you remember that map. We need like a bunch of defense missions with timers.
Yeah,
We need harvest the resource map. We need like these are all things that have nothing to do with the core gameplay, even offered by Warcraft 3's Melee. Like, that's the killer to me, is that there's one map that even comes close to offering that level of gameplay, and it's like the final mission of the entire project where you have a level 2 hero that you should then be looking to try to level up to level 10. Except they accelerate that part so fast because of the average experience provided by every enemy that you're attacking, on top of there being an insane pre-placed brigade. And then there's that immortal comment in one of the AI scripts where they say something to the effect of, this AI is not intended to be attacked, so it has uber defense. Like, what the
wow.
fuck? Like, that's actually them just admitting like they don't know how to design a game because they're literally saying that you're not meant to play the game against that particular AI. So, like, that's a case where it's just inexcusable. And even then, even with that that's the only one that even has a shell of the actual gameplay offered by the Melee. Not that you need to necessarily mirror the Melee game in your campaign. Like, you don't need to make it so that it's 100% the same game state, that you're fighting with the same tech tree options, that you're making it so that this is essentially education for playing multiplayer. But if multiplayer is the thing that lives on in your game, and that's the thing that most people will remember about your game, I think it goes without saying that your project, your single player experience, should in some way test the skill set of players and get them ready to, in theory, gravitate over towards multiplayer. Like, I don't think that's I don't necessarily think that it's 100% like what should always be the case, or like I see an argument for why people would want a completely distinct single player experience, but for the core content, I think you should find a way to tell a story in a way that's the least amount of destruction to the actual gameplay offered by the Melee game, the dominant Melee game, as possible. And obviously, like, Dota 2 eventually usurped the main game, or Dota 1 rather, eventually usurped the main gameplay offered by Warcraft 3, because the Melee fell out of favor compared to that. Which I think is just an indictment of how bad Warcraft 3 was to actually play, because people were just playing it for custom games as opposed to the actual content offered by Blizzard. But, you know, even if you're going to take a charitable opinion of that and just say, well, it's actually because Blizzard had this engine that was so easily changeable and modifiable so that people could make those fun game modes, like, even then, there's still, you know, there's nothing associated with the main campaign of playing either Dota or the Melee. So there's no component there where you're prepping the player to go into multiplayer and be a competitively viable player. And they essentially have to, like, unlearn all of the habits that they've learned playing campaign, which is one of the funniest things about, like, people recommending the campaigns to, for example, Brood War. Like, people will say, oh yeah, you should play the campaigns to get a fundamental feeling of how the races go. But you get taught so many poor habits playing the campaigns. You get taught never to scout because the AI's got a bunch of pre-play shit. You get taught barely ever to expand because you don't actually need it. It's actually better to one-base turtle if you don't have the APM to manage multiple bases. And it's certainly never a requirement. So you never have to learn that lesson of how to use, you know, get enough APM to manage multiple bases. And you get taught to, like, essentially mass up, never harass, never go out of your base aggressively, and just mass up until you have enough to completely wipe out the AI, all of their static defenders, and everything else that they have in their arsenal in one fell swoop. It's like mass up until you can kill the AI, and that's essentially the game plan. You don't want to engage with the AI because they have infinite money and they have positional advantage with a bunch of pre-play shit. So it's not like they're going to ever run out of stuff in that sense. So that's horrible habits to learn. Even the missions that are considered hard by the people who are just starting out playing the game, they're just, like, essentially ramped up versions of that gameplay loop, where it just means that you have to do that more often. Like, you've got to do that for multiple AI, or you have to do that for, you got to mass up to a bigger army size because of the sheer scale of pre-play shit in the AI bases. Or you have to actually expand a few times because of resource limitations, which in and of themselves end up being inconsistent with previous maps and essentially, like, testing an inconsistent skill set, which is another part of the whole argument for keeping things similar. So, yeah, I just ultimately think that it's certainly an interesting rabbit hole we went down just from that Golden Source mod and talking about that stuff. But I do think that, like, again, there's a compelling argument to be made that you should have a change of pace, and there's a compelling argument to be made that you should try to make a product that, or even just like a custom campaign or something that does change things up. But you have to be consistent with whatever you're changing. Like, you can't just change shit from mission to mission or whatever. And I was actually reminded of a lot of the RTS maps that I've played, or not really RTS maps, but maps within RTSs that I've played, like the Command and Conquer micro missions and some other stuff. When you were talking about, like, why can't I just skip this? Like, yeah, why can't I just skip this? Like, it has nothing to do with what I'm actually playing. Like, I'm looking forward to going back and playing the real game, but I have to deal with this weird gimmick, like bring your kid to work day product or something for whatever case, like however long that ends up lasting for. So that was something I found humorous. And it sounds like, at the very least, on a positive note, that Golden Source mod seems to have done a better job of that going forward, right? So,
yeah. Well, regarding what you said about the tutorials, I think that's, again, a very common argument to hear. Like, people say it all the time. If you want to learn the game, just play the campaigns.
Yeah.
I think in part that's due to people who maybe played the game so long ago. Like, I don't know, people who play StarCraft Brood War in 2020 and they say to newcomers, just play the campaign.
Yeah.
They probably played the campaign in, I don't know, 2001, and they don't remember anything about it, but they just have this false memory that they learned the game through playing the campaign, whereas I learned the game through playing it for as many years as they played it. And whereas that's a really common argument that you hear, that's why you brought it up. I think it's been pretty much debunked by the Age of Empires 2 new release, because basically Age of Empires 2 originally came with a tutorial, and the tutorial does a reasonable job in the sense that it tells you how to fucking drag the mouse over the units and move them, and it tells you what the fog of war is. I mean, that level of simplicity. Just so you've never played an RTS before and you don't fucking know.
Never used a computer before. First time using a mouse and keyboard. Yeah, like it's that level of tutorial.
In a sense, it's useful, but that's about it.
Right.
And that's people were complaining about that. They were saying, look, this tutorial, it may work for people who don't know how to fucking use a computer, which maybe at the time was actually a thing. But it's not
super early on, I could see an argument for it.
But nowadays, it's just not good enough. So they actually made a new tutorial that was, I actually have not played it, but I've heard it's based around actual, multiplayer rules, multiplayer tactics. So it actually makes an attempt to teach players the value of attacking up early, or expanding early, or map control, or early aggression, stuff like that. It actually makes an attempt to promote those concepts. And I think if Age of Empires 2 did it, then all the games can do it. And the reason people realized it for Age of Empires 2 is simply because it was released, like it had two re-releases on Steam, and it actually had a lot of people who were jumping into the game again, and those people demanded it. I mean, they asked the developers, can we have something that's better? Especially since there were already a few fan tutorials, so to speak. Like on the first release of the game on Steam, the HD release from 2013, someone that made a mod like a few years after it was released called the Fast Castle tutorial, which taught players like the most basic strategy that is used in multiplayer competitive gameplay, which is that of reaching the castle age fast and early, so that you can have better tech early on, which is a pretty strong tactic, although you are leaving yourself vulnerable to early aggression if you do that. But I mean, that fan tutorial made by a YouTuber basically became the blueprint for the developers themselves later, saying, okay, we're just going to go all the way. We're going to create a set of tutorials that actually explain the proper tactics and mechanics that people use in multiplayer. And I mean, that's a good thing. That's exactly what you're supposed to do. And unfortunately, even if you do that, that's not going to save you from the micromaps, because nothing can prepare you for those. But yeah, I figure I would mention this since you brought up the tutorial, and I think it's definitely something that Blizzard or others could learn from. But
for sure. I mean, imagine in Brood War if there was like a build order tutorial for every current like meta build order, you know what I mean? Like imagine if there was something like that, and then obviously that would be like advanced tier tutorials where you're just practice drilling. But if you look before that, it's like imagine if we had tutorials that explained how to expand properly and like what you need to be watchful of, because something that's super common when people play multiplayer in Brood War is they don't realize that when an enemy like rushes out at them with like a couple of units, if they can hold, they are in an advantageous position. Like they don't realize that you could actually just kill the player with an economy. If you just repel their early attack, your economic advantage, like say you do a fast expansion or whatever, if you can hold with less military investment, despite the fact that they went for a heavy military push, if you can like out micro them, or you can just drone drill on them or whatever, that can provide you a way into the game where on its face, if you don't know what the depth of an RTS, you don't know what's at play, you just assume, oh, there's 3 zealots in my base, and I don't even have my spawning pool just finished, and I don't even have any zerglings. Like you might assume that you're dead, and maybe you are, but if you can riposte that and keep enough drones alive, you can just go into like hydras and kill the guy or something. Like he doesn't have the economy that you have. He doesn't have the amount of workers you have. He can't, like the scaling factor is in your favor the longer the game goes on at that point, if you can, make it last long enough. And if you can hold with that, like nobody recognizes that. So if there was something to impart those kinds of like core principle values of like, here's what the game state really looks like. Because on its face, if you're just looking at it from an observer's perspective, you're like, oh man, 3 zealots in my base, I'm dead. But then if you had vision of his base while he was attacking you and you saw, oh, he's got like 12 probes. He cut probes hard to get these zealots out this fast. Or, he doesn't have an expansion and I have one or two. Or he doesn't have tech and I've got my Spire on the way. Or he's got police coming on his, knocking on his door or something like that. Like, there's many factors that can, play into the benefit of winning in an RTS match and the result of that. And you don't know that as a somebody who's just coming into the, never playing it before or not playing that much. And it takes a while for people to learn. Like, actually, I shouldn't necessarily GG out or tap out because I might be able to win.
Yeah.
The component
people
that you brought
just panic. They think they lost just because of a few units. For newcomers, that's very common.
Right. I think it plays into the idea that, the campaigns are really poor teachers for this sort of thing, right? Because, like, if you knew that your enemy was like, okay, if I have 3 zealots in my base and they've killed like 6 drones, I mean, I'm probably dead in that situation anyway. But say I have 1 or 2 zealots in my base and I've lost 1 drone and I've had to turn some of my larvae into zerglings and I haven't been able to drone up as much as I want. I'm in a bad position. But if those 1 or 2 zealots are owned by an AI that has all of the map control and a bunch of pre-placed shit and infinite money, I might be in a much worse position under those circumstances. And that's what the campaign teaches you. It doesn't teach you, like, here's an AI that has the same resources you do, same starting conditions you do, and relatively similar, like everything else. Like, you guys are starting off on the relative even footing, and it's a 1v1 and see what happens. Or it's a 2v2 and see what happens. Like, under those circumstances, which are completely foreign to the player, like even the way that you're playing the game, the circumstances of what your opponents are is completely different in a player versus player match or in one of these 1v1s compared to the campaign. So it's a completely different thing. And I think it's humorous that the Age of Empires 2 tutorials, I have also not played them myself, but I was talking about my plans for tutorials for Hydra and tutorials for my own RTS whenever we get to the point where we're making that. And I basically had said that, I want you to essentially be taking part in like a 1v1 where you've got an ally. Like, the one is actually your ally and you're just there to like observe and fight. He's like a grizzled veteran commander and he's like, he's handling all of his base, and you get to see what a really elite level player looks like or an experienced player looks like from the perspective of an AI. And essentially it's almost like not really a competition, but you could imagine like, oh, if I want to get really good, that's an easy practice drill that I can do. Like, how can I be on the same footing as this AI player is, where he's programmed to be excellent? Can I be at that level? Can I get to that point myself? Can I get better than him? Can I show him up? Can I somehow have more units than him at the end of it or whatever? And obviously he'd be like fighting a 1v1 against a player who's maybe equally matched. And then at some point he might get overwhelmed if you do nothing to help him in a situation like that. Like, that could be a situation where, all 3 players in this case are the same race. So it's very simple. Everybody's using the same structures and units. Everybody's got the same sort of tech available to them. You can learn about compositions in a natural way where you might go a composition that he's not going, your ally's not going, and then suddenly you've got complementary things and you're able to help attenuate whatever advantage the other player might have. You get to learn whatever you're guaranteed to learn 2 different compositions of units because it's whatever your ally has versus whatever the enemy has, and they're probably going to be different in that context. So you get to see a lot about that. You get to see multiple play styles at play, like maybe your ally's conservative and your enemy expands a lot. Situations like that could obviously arise, or maybe the enemy's super harassment oriented, whereas your ally's like just frontal type. So there's tons of things that you could do there where you get to see a lot of this stuff subconsciously in terms of play styles, and it can sort of condition you to seeing what a good player would do. Now, anyways, I was talking about that whole plan, and somebody had mentioned, oh yeah, so you're just going to do the Age of Empires 2 thing or whatever, because apparently that's what they do, is like they have you up against with an AI ally that you have vision of, and it's sort of like a race, like who can have the better base basically by the end of it or something. It's like a tutorial for showing you what the players do.
Tutorial, yeah.
Right, yeah. So I think something like that would be great for newcomers, and it seems like it's already been tried. So maybe not a totally original idea on my part, but I thought it was humorous that there was some similarities there, and certainly something that I want to investigate in the future, because I do feel like part of the reason why it's a self-fulfilling prophecy is a circular logic, in my opinion, where you have people saying that it's too hard to get into an RTS. And obviously nobody necessarily is creating a bunch of content for RTS players to learn. And if they can't learn, then they're not going to get into it. And they're just going to believe that it's too hard, right? So it's like, if there's nobody coming in to try to say, hey, this is actually circular logic, you can learn, here's some resources to learn, then it's a lot harder for people to just bite the bullet and go in. Which, I mean, I'm the kind of guy who I'm so much of an elitist that I feel like if you're not willing to suffer a little bit, then you're not willing to like you don't necessarily deserve the fruits of the labor if you're not willing to put in the labor. You know what I mean? So
Right.
nothing worth doing is necessarily easy in my book. Like there's ways to do it efficiently and optimize for efficiency, but there's you're going to have to try. You're going to actually have to put the work in. And I think that is a situation that most people seem averse to. But personally, I think that there's tons of value in I do think that there's tons of value in going in and trying to provide this kind of introductory content, get these people invested, and maybe they don't end up playing competitively, but if they at least grasp something, maybe they watch some streamers or they watch some events and they have a better understanding of things, like a better foundation to talk about stuff. And that can also be beneficial for growing a scene, more broadly speaking, even if they're not playing it themselves. So yeah, some interesting tidbits and topics there within the idea of trying to learn. And it's one of the key distinctions, I think, between between FPS and RTS. RTS is so complex and has so many different things going for it. No matter which game you look at, like you could look at Age of Empires 2, you could look at StarCraft. Both of these games have a lot of complexities to them, and it's not easy to immediately point out like, oh yeah, this is what this one is, this is what that one is. So yeah, there's a ton of like subtlety there. Whereas if you look at FPS games that are watched nowadays, most of the time it's relatively simple stuff like Counter-Strike or Quake, where it's like, all right, it's just I have to learn what these guns do, and a lot of them are super like easy to understand just on their face. Like, oh, the AK-47 is a rifle. I know what that is because it's a real world rifle. And like in Quake, it's a little bit more abstract because they've got like railgun or nail guns and like obviously like lightning guns and stuff. But even then, you can still figure that shit out just by watching, and it's pretty self-explanatory. So a lot easier to grasp. And even though there's a lot of complexities that will go over a lot of people's heads in those games, like the value of utility or the value of like picking somebody off and then like controlling an area of the map where there's going to be a weapon spawn or something like that, that happens in Quake. So stuff like that, I think is a big deal and does mean a lot, but you don't need to have a firm grasp of what that actually is and all the ramifications thereof to enjoy an FPS match if you're watching it, or to even play an FPS match. Whereas if you want to find success against somebody who does know about that stuff, you really do need to do your homework in that same way. Or if you want to really appreciate like what is actually happening in an RTS, you need to do your homework in that way, where that doesn't really happen in an FPS to the same degree. I don't know.
Well, at the very least, if you're watching an RTS match that's complex, you need to have a caster that fully explains what's going on at all times. That's the only way in which you can sort of understand, if not completely, what's going on as an external viewer.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is often not the case. I mean, if you're gonna get, I don't know, demos, for example, a lot of them don't have any commentary or whatsoever. Which, I mean, that's good for people who know the game, but for people who are complete newcomers, that's not gonna be very helpful. If they want to learn what's going on. But I think regarding Age of Empires 2 in particular, it's perhaps ironic that it basically had some sort of anti-micro movement within it. I don't even know what to call it. So basically what happened is that during the first release of the game on Steam, which, as I said, was in 2013, basically there was a new set of campaigns released for it. And these campaigns were heavy on the micro side. A lot of them were pretty experimental. I have to say that maybe they didn't even try to, like, I don't think they were necessarily lazy. I just think they were just trying to experiment as much as they could. For example, there was a map that you actually had to lose in order to progress. It was pretty strange. I mean, again, it was pretty dumb, but at least I guess they were just experimenting with stuff. But people actually complained about it. They would say, okay, so these are micro maps. I don't actually want to play this. I want to play Build and Destroy. I want to play micro maps, which I've never actually seen such a movement. Like, talk about Warcraft 3, for example. Has anyone ever said that regarding Warcraft 3 campaigns, be they custom or otherwise? I don't think anybody has ever said that, apart from, I guess, Alexander on Hive Workshop, that he has to keep his standards away from Arcane. But yeah, like, this was actually a pretty popular movement within the Age of Empires 2 game community. There were many micro maps made beforehand on the website, like on I think it's called Age of Kings Heaven, which is a pretty popular website that deals with Age of Empires and a bunch of related series like Empire Heart and other games. And on that website there were a bunch of micro campaigns, but even in that case, even back then, so in the early 2000s, even then they were labeled as micro maps. So if you were searching for campaigns that were purely about micro, you would find them just by applying a filter. So even then they were separate, and the community did not like the fact that they were just merged into the main game that way, where you get a campaign where, I don't know, there's 5 missions, 4 of them are micro and 1 of them is macro. They just didn't like that. So what actually happened is that on the latest re-release, which I think is from last year, they actually remade all those campaigns from scratch. So the micro elements are almost now completely absent from what I've heard. I've actually not played them yet. And they actually have no... They don't have any micro overwhelming superiority now. They just build and destroy maps. They have some of the same storytelling themes, like the characters or whatever are the same, but the missions are completely new. The maps are new, and they're all about base building and stuff now. So that's a pretty cool thing to see, and I don't understand why it happened to this game but not to the others, to be honest. That's really puzzling to me. Like that you have this movement in the game where the player base just saw the micro maps and went, fuck this, I want something better, and the developers actually delivered. So that's a unique phenomenon, I would say.
Yeah, if only
I've
it was
never
more
seen
common.
that. Yeah, I've never seen that elsewhere.
I can't believe that they just decided to start mixing it up in the first place. One of the things that really gets me about the Age of Empires series is that they've had so many re-releases for so many different games, and they've obviously remade a ton of campaigns and stuff. And even after that, set aside the remakes, there's also released a bunch of content. It's a mess to try to figure out what you should actually be doing. You know what I mean? What you should actually be playing. What's the lineup here? What's the order? That's why for my playthrough of those games, I'm just going to commit to whatever was originally released or whatever. Not necessarily the original version, but looking for the content that's in terms of how it was originally, the order in which it was released. So here's just the main content and that sort of thing. So that's what I think makes the most sense to do anyway, is try to just play what was on the disc initially in terms of campaigns 1 through 4. And then if I like the game, I'll keep playing. And if I don't, we'll just leave it there. I played the original game, should be enough.
Yeah. I mean, for Age of Empires 2, the definitive edition on Steam, they actually have the original campaigns in relatively untouched form. They just remade basically the ones they made afterwards.
Yeah.
If it were up to me, I would say they should have remade even some of the old ones. But at least you're clear when it comes to that. You can just play the original content with some quality of life improvements.
Right. Which is fine too. I'm also not necessarily looking to be have a historically accurate version of the game on my playthrough. I want to see what all of the hubbub has been with the remake as well. It's one of those things that I do agree that they should probably, without even needing to play it, I should be able to comfortably agree they should have remade the earlier stuff as well. But it's at the same time, I don't know how trustworthy the community is for the developers. You know what I mean? I know, for example, if Blizzard said that they were going to remake the campaigns and also do balance changes or whatever to Brood War, everybody would have been no, we don't. I don't think so. That's not going to work out. Everybody would have been immediately at least with the campaigns, I could say it's hard to do a worse job. But with regards to the actual game state, no, don't touch it. What's wrong with you? So yeah, there's a lot there, I suppose, to unpack, because I do think that if you're an Age of Empires dev and you're going to be remaking content that came out well after that was played by less people is probably a safer bet. You're not going to deal with as many people's sacred cows, as it were. So there's probably a little bit more going on there. I would just say as well, if you're going to offer some remakes, maybe have that be released alongside the original content in the first place so that they can choose which version they want to play. But that also muddies the waters in a bit, because it's kind of confusing for newcomers. What should they play? Should they play the original, or should they play the remade or enhanced or whatever you want to call it? And there's been so many enhancements and changes and new versions for the games themselves that it's easy to lose track as somebody who doesn't pay a huge amount of close attention to what's going on. But it does seem like the most recent versions of both the first and second games are actually superior ones. I've heard some very hilarious things about the third game's remaster, though.
Yeah.
Hoop Thrower in the Discord servers.
I mean, even the Steam reviews, the second game on Steam has overwhelmingly positive reviews, which is not something you see every day.
Yeah.
Whereas the third game, let me just check. Reviews are mixed. 59% of the reviews are positive. I mean, they just fucked up. They just completely
it's honestly
fucked up.
hard to have a value that low. Like some people would say, well, it's still above 50. But Steam reviews are some of the most casual fucking things possible.
Yeah.
In terms of like whether or not you're actually going to be determining reception. I mean, they're subject to abuse in the same way that like review bombing Warcraft 3's Reforged, right? The remaster of that, like where that got like 0.01 or something on Metacritic for a while because people were review bombing it. That's like that's subject to abuse as well. People have downvoted and written negative reviews on Steam for things as like tame as like, oh, the developer is on a different platform now. Like they released the sequel to this game came out on another game store, Epic Game Store or something instead of Steam. So we're going to downvote the original. Like, obviously, there's some stupid cases for it. But generally speaking, the people who are writing reviews and leaving reviews on Steam, some of the more casual players, honestly, like they don't really necessarily have a lot of standards. They're not looking for something that's going to be like in the same way that you or I would actually want to qualitatively review something. They're just going to go off of whether or not they had fun, and when they're probably watching fucking anime or goat porn or something on the second monitor while they're playing their game, they're not really worried about whether or not it fully engages them because they're not like focused on it in the same way. So like that's something that I think probably started with all these MOBA games, is that like League of Legends is the ultimate like stream game or game where you're just like trying to zone out in the middle of. So you'll have like a podcast on in the background, or you'll be like watching something on in the other monitor, and you're not really focused on any one thing, but it's not like either one of those demands the majority of your brain power. So I do feel like a lot of people are not just sitting down to play League of Legends. They probably got music on in the background. They probably got something else on in the background. Whereas like I imagine the same thing is true for a lot of these Steam games that people are reviewing. And if they are actually fully sucked in, then I don't know what the fuck is going through their heads, because some of these games are really goofy. Like the Batman game that I played somewhat recently was like mostly positive reviews for that game as well. But yeah, as far as the Age of Empires 3 game goes, I've heard that they fucked up not only like some basic shit, but they also apparently were like censoring part of the game mechanics for the some of the Native American tribes or something. Or that might have been a different game entirely, but I remember Hoopter talking about that.
Well, basically what happened is that so let's backtrack a bit.
Yeah.
So the first two Age of Empires re-releases were handled by the same company, I believe. And the first one was a bit of a disaster initially, but apparently it's pretty much improved now with patches, which probably laid the groundwork for the second game's re-release to be much more successful, basically.
Right.
In that there's no bugs or crashes or anything. Like the release went pretty smoothly on like the first game, so they laid the groundwork for it, and it worked. But for the third game, they hired completely different studios. Apparently, there were 3 studios working on it: one in America, one in Europe, and one in Australia. Now, I don't have anything against international collaboration, but the only reason you would do that as a company is to cut costs. No other reason. It's not about them being the most qualified people you can find, because I'm sure in America you can find 2 other companies that you can work it if you really need that. But the reason they went to fucking, I don't know, Australia, and I don't know where they went in Europe or even in America, maybe the studio is European, I don't know. But that's the problem, that they just decided to cut costs. That really casts a shadow on the game itself before it even fucking began production.
Yeah, of course.
But on top of that, what happened is that the American company, without telling the other two, so without telling, I think the Australian company was the one doing the gameplay, so without telling them, they hired 2 Native American consultants in an attempt to make the game a bit more historically accurate. I think in a way that's fine if you want to do that, if you want to present the game in a more authentic fashion instead of whatever made up bullshit they had originally. But the problem is that those 2 Native American guys, they didn't know what the fuck to say about it, because they were like, well, we don't know anything about these games. I don't know what you're trying to do. One of the 2 didn't even have any experience in the gaming industry. So in the end, what they did, basically, they did the most fucking asinine approach possible, where they just contacted these 2 random guys just because they felt they needed to, without even thinking about their qualifications. Like, I cannot really honestly blame those 2 Native American guys, because they were just approached about it. They didn't fucking know they were gonna be involved in this disaster. It was the company's fault for not doing any background checks and for not caring about what they were actually doing, because otherwise they would have at least told the other 2 companies what they were going to do. And basically, one of the 2 Native American guys well, first of all, one of the civilizations was renamed from Sioux to Lakota, or maybe the other way around. And apparently, the only reason this was done was because one of the developers was a big fan of spaghetti western movies, which featured this tribe in question, which wasn't really relevant at all historically, but it often shows up in classic western movies. So the tribe was renamed not for historical accuracy, but just to have a fucking western reference, which is, like
Okay.
kind of going the opposite direction of what their stated aim was, right? And basically, they told them that Native Americans working in mines is a stereotype because that's what they were doing in the early days of colonization. So basically, they told them this: like, if you display Native Americans working in mines, that's a bit offensive, Then you figure it out what to do. So what the fuck do? They just take this random comment from this Native American guy and they say, okay, so we're going to remove mines from the game for the Native Americans. And what we're going to do instead, we're going to have them build a market next to the mine, and then they're just going to magically get the resources that way through having a market next to it. Like, I don't know. It's probably just so absurd that it's hard to even comprehend how they came up with it.
Yeah.
But that's literally all they did. They didn't do anything other changes. They didn't change the borderline racist accents of the Asian units, which are completely fake accents. They didn't change like any of the other historical inaccuracies, like fucking Napoleon flying the French monarchy flag, even though he was the fucking head of the subsequent post-revolutionary government. I mean, everyone has heard of the French Revolution, right? The French Revolution abolished the monarchy. So why would Napoleon have the monarchy flag? I mean, that's a pretty elementary school issue that they could have fixed and they didn't. So they basically just had these two consultants and they didn't know what the fuck to do. They gave them two comments and they employed them in the most asinine way possible. I mean, it's just a mess. And they didn't even tell the other two companies. So, like 1 week before release, they were forced to implement those changes in the most quick way they could think of, and that's the end result. On top of all the bugs and the crashes and the inferior performance and the fact that apparently the game actually crashed, it actually broke some computers. Like they actually had to uninstall Steam in order to fix it, or some other insanity.
Wow. Okay, so it sounds like it's more than just a couple of stupid things along the way that are very minor. Like this stuff impacts gameplay, apparently impacts whether or not the game even works, and the computers even work. Wow. Well, yeah.
But I mean, everyone expected it to be bad because Age of Empires 3 is a bit of the black sheep in the series. Basically, not many people like it. Although
I can see why.
I say that many people like it, but not in the community. Basically, it's like the same people who like Warcraft 3 like it, basically, but they're not Age of Empires fans otherwise. Like the people who actually like the originals do not like the third one usually.
Okay, yeah. So sort of, in that way, it's almost identical.
It's the same as how Brood War fans are not slighted to like Warcraft 3, whereas most people who played Blizzard games have either played World of Warcraft or World of Overwatch or Warcraft 3, basically.
Yeah, or StarCraft versus StarCraft 2, right? Is another.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, it's just a disaster, and definitely one that could have been avoided, especially considering how successful their previous release was. But I guess they just didn't give a shit about it, and that's the end result. A disaster.
A disaster indeed. Well, I'm not actually sure if there's anything else we even need to talk about per se. If there are any other projects that you've played recently or anything else that's left an impression.
I can mention one more before we move on. I'm sure there will be plenty of opportunities in future episodes to talk about others. So one I played recently is one Wolfenstein 3D mod called Wolfenstein Reloaded, which was released in 2006, so it's pretty old. And I played it mostly because I actually heard about the sequel, which is Spear of Destiny Reloaded. Both of these modes are essentially remakes of the original games.
Right.
And I figured before I played the Spear of Destiny Reloaded, which is what I heard about, I would just play the original as well. And it wasn't very good. It tried to do some new things, and in some cases it worked, but a lot of the time it was just not very effective. In that the level design was at times a little bit too samey. Like it felt like the same guy just made all the levels and reused a lot of the same gameplay ideas throughout, which I guess I can connect to the change of pace argument from earlier in a minute.
Of course.
But other than that, it also had some changes to the game state. Whereas, for example, some enemies, they were basically the same, but they were much more beefy in terms of HP points, and also they would fire much faster. So they basically became a pain to deal with, even though they were not really. They did not play a different role than what the vanilla enemy did, but they were just made more annoying to deal with, basically. So it had some cool moments. I especially liked in the third episode, because it has 6 episodes, 60 levels. Took me a while to get through it. Took me like a week. Fortunately, the levels are not too big, but it had some cool elements. Like there's a level on the third episode where you have to go through the streets of Berlin and get into a few buildings, which is a pretty cool thing to see in such an old engine. But also, it was made for DOS. Like, they took the source code and compiled it for DOS, but it doesn't perform very well. Unfortunately, they should have just used a source port, which admittedly in 2006 they were few and far between at the time. Now they're much more well established, but without a re-release, that's not going to happen. So it was pretty choppy, like it was a bit laggy, and it had those annoying beefy enemies, and the level design was a bit too samey. So in that case, like when it did change the pace, that was very much welcome. But at the same time, that doesn't excuse the fact that it had to do that in the first place. Like the mainline content should have been good. That being said, the mod was apparently made in just 6 months, and it was originally only meant to be like a graphics replacement mod. And the new graphics are pretty reasonable. Like, all of them are new, made specifically for the mod, except some of the enemy sprites. So yeah, I just played it mostly for history's sake, but it definitely got me thinking about the change of pace video that you posted back when you, was it like last week, I think? 2 weeks ago, maybe?
One of the recent Crow Pills, yeah.
And as I played it, I was actually thinking about your video and how it was actually related in that when it did change the pace, like with the Berlin level, that was good, but also the fact that it felt as good as it did, even though the level was just okay, was simply because the mainline content was not good enough. But at least I got it out of the way, and I look forward to playing the sequel in the coming weeks, I guess.
Yeah. Sounds like it's a more straightforward project than the Golden Source one you were talking about.
Yeah, for sure.
It's interesting. I imagine remakes of those old FPS games must be like a dime a dozen. You know what I mean? So I'm always curious as to what people actually do. Obviously, this is an older one. You're talking about a 2006 one. I'm curious what the difference will be for the one that was released more recently for the expansion, because you really like. There's been remakes, for example, of Brood War, and like things, obviously none of them are particularly noteworthy or good in terms of like custom campaigns that are meant to just be improved versions of the main project. But I am curious as to like what will end up setting that one apart, just because, it's something that requires so much. You do need to set yourself apart somehow. You know what I mean? So like it's got to happen somehow, and especially when there's so many. And I imagine it's only more numerous in the FPS community to have like complete remakes.
Yeah. There's many remakes, but many are unfinished actually, because people just realize, well, I should just probably be making my own project.
Yeah. I should probably do something original. Yeah.
Like, I mean, this mod came out in 2006, but it didn't play nearly as well as a classic mod like Coming of the Storm, which came out 2 years before. And it had much better level design. It had much more complex enemy types. So again, like, it's an old mod, but even though it was made quickly by only one person, I think, like, it's mostly interesting for historical reasons and for some of the ideas that it did well. And but yeah, on the whole, it definitely was a bit dull. But hopefully the sequel is better. I've heard the sequel is very complex. I may as well just cite whatever it says here regarding the sequel. I'll also provide the links as before, both for the original and the sequel that I haven't played yet.
I think one of the only projects that I've even heard about recently has been a StarCraft campaign called As Cold as Ice, or Cold as Ice, or something like that. Has Cold as Ice in it. So I don't know if it's As Cold as Ice or not. Got mixed signals from the thread. I'll put a link in the description as well. But I have not played it myself, but DF, the man, Darkened Fantasies, he's been the one who's suffered through that. And, well, apparently it's like even more gimmicky, and it's like all of the things that we were talking about with the AI that have a bunch of pre-placed shit and all that stuff. It's like that to another level, with like super limited tech for no reason and random inexplicable triggers. But it's not meme enough. It's not funny enough to play. So it's unlikely that I would give it that much of a shout on my own channel in terms of a playthrough. But that's been apparently a real miserable experience for DF. So not really anything positive to say, but I guess it's just more of a reinforcement of the idea that if you're going to make something, you're going to need to do something a little bit more. You want to stay within the actual gameplay loop of the multiplayer or whatever the dominant gameplay pattern is, or you need to successfully create something that actually has a full gameplay loop, like what we were talking about with Golden Source. And I've never seen that in a micro project or in a project where it's like, gimmick melee, gimmick RTS stuff, you know what I mean? Where it's like a bunch of unfair advantages for one player. It just ends up feeling like you were out of shit, like you couldn't figure out how to make something real, or you didn't want to put in the effort, and so you just decided to fake it. And that's a common denominator in general, not even just in video game content, but generally speaking, when you have people who are like forcing the issue of trying to, like, maybe they've got the sad violins to try to make you feel a little emotional at this moment in a movie or something, like it's a hallmark of just bad components, like, incompetence, I guess, where you can't sell the player or the audience on whatever is supposed to be there organically. And so you have to essentially fake it. And that's something that I commented on a lot in the StarCraft playthrough that I did somewhat recently in the last couple of months, where I was basically talking about how they essentially have to fake the scale being really big and the stakes being really high. So they have to fake it through dialogue and through like telling you basically, oh, this is a really big moment, and here's all of these epic character moments, and oh, this is a really worthy opponent you have, even though he's a brain dead lunatic in game. So stuff like that really grinds my gears, man. Really, at this point, it's just so exhausting to me because I've seen it so many times. But I guarantee you that, like, the faucet is not dry.
That's where it came from.
Yeah, there's going to be more. There's going to be more to come in there. So, yeah.
But I mean, I think that's pretty much all. Those two mods were the main ones I wanted to talk about for this episode. But like I said, I'm sure there will be many opportunities. This episode was mostly to set the stage, basically, for what's to come, like for the type of stuff we talk about. We're probably going to cover many different topics.
Oh, yeah,
maybe sure. Sometimes not even related to games. I don't know, like
we might talk about movies stuff. Or
exactly,
TV shows or whatever we end up. It's a shit talking kind of like loose talking podcast. So. Obviously, taking suggestions. If there's something in particular you want us to explore, you can comment that in the description. But for the most part, or in the comment section rather. But for the most part, there's it's going to be relatively centered around RTS and FPS games and whatever else we've experienced. And so I guess there's that, right? So I don't know if you have any final words or any closing thoughts, but I think it was a successful opening episode. Really set the stage, like you said.
It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to doing more of this. And I'm sure there's many topics that I cannot even think about, but maybe I'll have more ideas in the coming weeks, in the coming days. There's many things that are worth exploring, more worth talking about, and I hope you guys will find it as enjoyable as we are. Like you will find it as enjoyable watching it as we are finding it talking about it. So, that's pretty much it for me.
All right, thanks very much for joining me, Dynamo, and we'll see you guys on the next one.
See ya, Silva.